Okay, I just got done watching The Headbangers History on VH1. I think it was an excellent documentary, but I want to round off a few things that I found were missing in the history of heavy metal, because they touch on a lot of the aspects, but some were missing, and some credit that should be given to some certain artists weren't giving. So I'm going to give a rundown on some history that might have been missed. Now, everyone seems to credit Black Sabbath for starting with the heavy sound, and sometimes they go back to Cream, they go to Hendrix, which is true, which are a lot of the roots of the heavy sound. But the one thing that I found was missing and was a major influence on all the bands back then was Frank Zappa. If you go back to 1965, to Frank Zappa's album Freak Out, you'll find a song titled Who Are the Brain Police, which has an extremely heavy sound. That was the point from where regular music, pop music, was transformed into something different, something new, and something heavy. I worked in a record store about 20 years ago, and all I was addicted to was heavy music. That's what all I would search out. And to me, heavy metal should be 40% heavy, 40% fast, 20% whatever else. But all I would do was go in and listen to all these different records and try to find heavy music. Now, granted, unfortunately, back then, you found heavy stuff, but you couldn't find a whole heavy record. It wasn't like a Black Sabbath record. Black Sabbath was the first to actually take that sound and put it collectively on one record. And the other bands, like the album I mentioned, the Frank Zappa, you find the heavy sound, but, the rest of the album, you lose stuff. But that's your history. Starts off with Frank Zappa. Then you moved into a band like Cream, which brought a heavy sound and put a riff into it, which then moved up to Jimi Hendrix and Jimi Hendrix Experience, which brought it up a notch again and put a little bit more emphasis into the lead guitar, which Jimi Hendrix had a heavy sound that wasn't even recreated up until the 90s. He was way ahead of his time with his sound. And after you get to Jimi Hendrix, you have to move up to the Pink Floyd, which they're famous for their mellow sound, and you lose a lot in the translation if you listen to Dark Side of the Moon. But in the early days, you could find certain tracks off of the Pipers of the Gates of Dawn, like Astronomy Domine and Interstellar Overdrive, which started with some working in some heavy sounds. And then you have Let There Be More Light off of Saucerful of Secrets, which starts off with a bass line, which influenced Cliff Burton, which ended up being a Master of Puppets track. And if you go back, you can do your homework. If anyone finds me that I'm wrong or finds other information that I missed, please feel free to post it, because I'd like to learn some of this too. And after that, if you moved up into maybe, I think, 1968, that's when Deep Purple hit the scene, which they brought in the triads, trade-off leads, which were very famous when Judas Priest came along, and Iron Maiden. And in 1968, you also have a band called The Nice, which put out a song called America, which was a retake of the track off of the soundtrack of the West Side Story. But that brought in a whole new element of sound. I mean, if you go back traditionally, like they said, the blues, but probably the first heavy metal song as far as the writing structure was probably Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Okay? And after you get that, 1968, if you move into 1969, which is actually predating Black Sabbath, if you could find an album called King Crimson and Court of the Crimson King, there's a track on there called 21st Century Schizoid Man, which brought in a heavy sound. And if you listen, there's some remnants of the same type of writing that Black Sabbath used in Electric Funeral off the Paranoid record. And in 1969, you also had Led Zeppelin, which brought in another element, which was part of heavy metal. Because in heavy metal, if you go post-1970, you will find these four bands in anything that was considered metal. Some influence of one of them or all are found in it. And you'll find Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, and Alice Cooper. They are the four major bands that were in the influence of metal, whether image-wise, sound-wise, song structure, whatever. Okay, and in 1969, if you want to talk about the beginning of the whole black leather jacket look, the biker look, the long hair look, if you look at Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull, even though Jethro Tull beat out Black Sabbath, Metallica, back in 1988 for the heavy metal band, Jethro Tull was the farthest thing from that type of music at that point. But back in the early day, they were one of the founders. Ian Anderson was one of the first to have the long beard, the hair, the leather biker jacket in '69 when everyone else were wearing fringes. And if you listen to the album Stand Up, there's a song for 1,000 Mothers, and that's where you'll find a lot of the influence that was put into bands like Iron Maiden, which is they've admitted. And what is it, the Sweet Dream. And yeah, I advise, if you want to listen to these songs, try to find the vinyl, because the vinyl is a heavier sound than on CD, because they didn't translate well, some of these songs. But you have those bands which were an influence in on it. 1970, Black Sabbath came along, of course, everybody knows that. Black Sabbath, the title track was just, you know, they brought the horror element, you know, real, truly heavy sound, and they put it across the board. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff I mentioned, you're going to have to find in dribs and drabs in certain albums. And in that 1971, Alice Cooper arose. 1970, Deep Purple also changed their sound when they got Ian Gillan and Roger Glover in the band. And if you want to look for that famous Gallop, which you find in a lot of metal songs, if you go to 1970 and you get the album In Rock of Deep Purple, that's where Ian Gillan brought in, like, you know, 5-octave vocals, the high screams, which are famous in metal, and that Gallop, if you'll find on a track called Hard Loving Man. And then not only that, the organ sound changed, where John Lord ran it through Marshall stacks, used distortion, turned up a screw in the back of an organ, which caused an overdrive sound. And after that point, the sound of music got a lot heavier. And even Black Sabbath admitted using a Hammond organ, I believe, on the Masters of Reality album to add and give a heavier sound. Plus, Tony Iommi's tuned down guitars because of his lost fingertips, which was, you know, a very important element in heavy metal. But these are basically the bands you'll find. And if you believe it or not, if you find an album from Genesis titled Nursery Crime, there's a track on it called The Musical Box, and if you can make your way through some acoustic guitar and flutes in the beginning, which breaks in the middle, which is a very heavy metal guitar type lead, which was definitely an influence on Iron Maiden, admittedly. And there's also a track on there called Return of the Giant Hogweed. Like I said, you're not going to find true heavy metal from front to back on these albums, but this is the elements and the roots of heavy metal. And 1972, if you listen to Yes's Fragile album, 1971 rather, the band Yes, Fragile. Unfortunately, the track Heart of the Sunrise, it's not a heavy fast song all the way through, but if you listen to the intro, another element of speed that was put in there in the music, which also, you know, was elevated by Deep Purple 1970. You got your speed from Deep Purple, virtuoso guitar leads, you got you know, Black Sabbath, you got your heavy sound, your doomy sound. Alice Cooper brought in the raunchy sound. He brought in a lot of the horror element as well. And Led Zeppelin brought in a lot of that raw sound that came into heavy metal, and, you know, the elements that came to all the different types of metal genres. And then Uriah Heep came out, and they kind of mixed the elements of Black Sabbath and Deep Purple. They used a heavy organ sound of Deep Purple.